Tobacco, tobacco, sing sweetly for tobacco. Tobacco is like love, oh, love it, for you see, I will prove it.
In the poem that we just looked at together, Sam Hazel imagines Mark Twain's last moments with a corncob pipe. You've probably read some of Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain's works before in a previous class, maybe Huck Finn or Tom Sawyer. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. We're reading from Mark Twain's autobiography, which from his request was published much later after his death. And this, look at this. And this is only volume 1. We're reading just a small selection of that for this module. In it, Twain tells a story of a dinner party where the expectation would be that he would provide cigars at the end. But it comes out that the only cigars he has are long nines. Now, I know that probably won't make any sense to anyone here because we don't buy things like that now. But if you've heard of cheroots, the cigar that Clint Eastwood's smoking in spaghetti Western movies, the sort of thin, cheap cigars, that's something like a long nine. So it's going to be a very cheap cigar. And that's a plus for Twain, but not for the others. And so they only have this cheap cigars to have. And Twain decides that we're going to pass those out. His butler is very concerned, very chagrined by this, and passes out. And the different dinner guests, seems like some illustrious parsons, are starting to smoke them. And one by one, they start having different pretenses. Like, oh, I got to get to the train to go take care of a sick parishioner and things like that. So they're all gone, which Twain and his characteristic humor is very amused by. Where I think this relates to the idea of poetic intuition and the idea of a hermeneutics of love is twofold. One, Twain has a different appreciation for long nines. He talks about it as during his time as a boat pilot, a cub pilot in the Mississippi, I had a great affection for them because they were not only, to my mind, perfect, but you could get a basket full of them for a cent or a dime. Twain talks about, before your assigned readings, he talks about how he does not like the very expensive cigars. He has this appreciation of the cheaper cigars. And there's sort of almost a pride in getting the deal too. And because of that, and this is kind of a different view of love than the earlier stories about a mother loving her son and buying him a drum. But there's an appreciation there that leads to insight and knowledge of the object, the long nine. That's one way you can look at this, that he has an appreciation for it, he has a taste for it. Here's another way I would like you to think about it as you're reading through this work in relation to what we're talking about with Hazel and what we'll talk about with our other readings for this week. There's an appreciation that Twain has for the different guests. Notice that there's this way where he's talking about the different guests, like Reverend Dr. Parker was the first man to light. He took 3 or 4 heroic whiffs, then gave it up. He got up with the remark that he had to go to the bedside of a dying parishioner, which I knew was a lie, because if that had been the truth, he would have gone earlier. So in some ways, that's kind of a hermeneutics of suspicion, like, oh, Reverend Dr. Parker, we both know what's really going on here. But there's an aspect of affection to it. He's describing all of these men who are taking their puffs of the tobacco, make, oh, I can't take this. And then he's interpreting them where it's somewhat suspicion, there's underlying motives, but there's a care to it, kind of a jolly aspect to it. So something you can think about too, whether you're doing reparative reading or hermeneutics of suspicion, how does this aspect of appreciation of what you're reading or what you're studying affect who you are as a researcher? I know many of you are concerned because your empirical training, which is right and good, is telling you to be an impartial researcher. But there are times, especially in research in the humanities, where as human subjects, rather than objects, we have a subjective interpretation because we appreciate, and that's a form of insight. This week, we are making an important transition from studying the commodified tobacco of our text so far to looking at the 7 rituals of the Lakota sacred pipe. Central to this study is this figure of Nicholas Black Elk. He was a very fascinating person, and I argue is actually very important to Americanist and Victorianist study. He's been essential. The writings that he's dictated, the letters, different works on have been essential to American Indian studies. But my fellow Victorianists do not look at this person enough, and I hope that changes soon. He is someone who was at the Battle of Little Bighorn and survived the Wounded Knee massacre. He was a Lakota holy man. He was someone who went with the Buffalo Bill Wild West show and traveled across the Atlantic to England and performed when Queen Victoria was present. Later in life, he converted to Catholicism and became a catechist. So this is someone who's traveling and teaching. Catechesis means teaching. And today, he is now in the process of being canonized and becoming a saint according to the custom of the Catholic Church. His current title is Servant of God. It's Servant of God, then Venerable, then Beati, then Saint. So quite a process, and he's at the beginning of it. But this is someone who has all these different cultural aspects in religion and his travels and the movement from 19th century to 20th century. This person has so much of that transition in his own life. And what you read for this week is his dictation to Joseph Epes Brown about the rituals of the sacred pipe and the beginning of them. So let's think about that a little. This is an image that you could find at Pipestone, Minnesota, where there are active quarries for pipestone used to make pipes. You have this story where the white buffalo calf woman visits the Lakota and gives them the sacred pipe and starts telling them the rituals they use it for. With the first one, the one that you read, being at someone's death. I want to read something very important from what Black Elk wrote at the beginning, sort of in his preface to it. It says, "We should understand well that all things are the works of the Great Spirit. We should know that he is within all things, the trees, the grasses, the rivers, the mountains, and all the four-legged animals, and the winged peoples. And even more important, we should understand that he is also above all these things and peoples. When we do understand all this deeply in our hearts, then we will fear and love and know the Great Spirit, and then we will be and act and live as he intends." And this is signed in Manderson, South Dakota. That is where Black Elk was laid to rest. You can visit his grave now. It's by St. Agnes Catholic Church in Manderson. So what we're seeing here is something very different than sort of the different texts we've been reading. They may have worked at an idea of ritual, such as Willem Flusser's idea of the ritual of pipe smoking, where he meant ritual in a different way, not necessarily that would be efficacious or change something. He had a different word for that, but a ritual that had no necessary purpose. And then we see in the rituals that Black Elk is describing that they do have a purpose. And we know in the Catholic theology through his conversion that the rituals such as the Eucharist that he would attend and receive, that would have this idea of efficacy that is being done. Flusser would call that magic rather than ritual. So this is a different view of ritual that Flusser has that you learned in the first one than the view of ritual as effecting something that we see in these readings and in Nicholas Black Elk's life. In your research, if you're wanting to look more into sacred pipe, you can visit the quarries in Pipestone, Minnesota. I don't know how many of you are still within East River or in surrounding states or not, but if you are around here, it's not a far drive from Sioux Falls. You're seeing Pipestone here. These are the quartzite rocks that you're seeing. So they mine both pipestone, which is softer, and quartzite there. It's a very beautiful place. There's lots of the rangers there have lots of different knowledge they can share with you. And there are master pipe makers working there doing demonstrations over the summer. You can also see the active quarries that are happening now, where persons are going in to mine and bring out pipestone to use for the making of a pipe. And there's been important changes in the past. They used to sell the pipestone or sell the pipes, but that's concerning to the Native American community because these are sacred objects for them. And when we watch Father the Flame, you'll see one of the pipe makers talk about his experience, and he's in Pipestone, of his experience where going in to the quarry, that's important to be prepared for that spiritually, because you will take things with you in his belief, and that you prepare it. It's a spiritual process of mining the pipestone and then refining it and carving it into the pipe that will be used for one of the rituals. Something I also want us to think about during this module is how Nicholas Black Elk, who you're seeing before you, and also that's the icon behind me in all of these videos, is a focus of hermeneutics in himself, a focus of interpretation. We've been focusing on interpretation all of these weeks so far. There's really three major interpretations of his life centered on his conversion to Catholicism. The question is, did he convert under duress and still secretly practice the Lakota ritual? Did he convert to Catholicism and no longer practice at all? Or did he convert to Catholicism and act as a catechist and continue to practice in an integrative way Lakota spirituality? And different texts and different persons who are part of his family or his life will interpret that differently. And that's going to be an important part. The canonization process happening will be an interpretive, a hermeneutic process. And so if you want to research him further, think about how any biography you read will have probably a stake in this interpretive process, will have a side on it. And so use your own hermeneutics of suspicion sort of lens when you're reading the biographies and say, do you agree with that? For example, Black Elk Speaks by Nyhart is a very important and foundational text for understanding Black Elk. It takes the interpretive lens of focusing on his role as Lakota holy man and basically ignores his conversion. It's to the point where we have a dictated letter from Black Elk that the Diocese of Rapid City puts in their website that he talks about it. He's concerned about it. Then we have the reading you had today, which seems to not avoid or ignore things the way that Nyhart's work does, but still it's focusing on how he is currently at that time practicing with sacred pipe, and that his teaching on the different rituals and the origin story. More recently, there's John Sweeney's book that you can see here. That's one that it came out, maybe a year or two ago. And its focus is on trying to have an integrative view of Nicholas Black Elk that includes all of his life and doesn't stop at the time that he's a catechist. And there's sort of a backwards looking interpretation where, from the view of documents that came out after Black Elk's death, later in 20th century, from the Catholic Church, had a different view of religions, and sort of reading that sort of more integrated view back onto Black Elk's life. So it's a form, Sweeney's work is a form of interpretation. Something to remember, all historical work, all literary work, really all academic work is a form of interpretation. We're interpreting the data, we're interpreting the evidence and making an argument about it for others. We've come to the end of our exploration of different hermeneutical strategies you can use to interpret these different texts. For the future videos, we'll focus on how to give a conference paper, and then we'll have a final reflection on all the content that we've had. So there's going to be 2 more lectures. What I want to emphasize in regard to these recent lectures is that these are different hermeneutical options for you. It's different ways for you to choose to interpret, and you are not limited to necessarily one in a given analysis. You can move back and forth between them. There can be ways where you say, suspicion makes sense for this text and my relationship to it, or this connaturality makes sense where I'm interpreting text. Now, if you do think one is right over the other, like you more agree with it, some of you may think, no, I need to have a suspicious reading, I need to be a critical thinker. Good. As might think, oh, the personalist aspects of Maritain's philosophy was attractive. Great. But what's most important in the end is that I hope you find a way to personally engage these texts and find a research project that's meaningful to you. That'll be the most important thing as you experience the text and experience your own research.
Tobacco is like love. Oh, love it. For you see, I have